Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's go back to 2011. A wave of truly historic uprisings swept across the Middle East and North Africa, and it sparked this incredible hope for a new democratic future. But as you know, a decade later, that hope, well, for many, it's faded. So today, we're going to dig into what went wrong and what might come next.
At the time, the optimism was just immense. Western leaders, like then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were all in on this idea. They believed that these new democracies would create stronger, more stable partners. It really was seen as a strategic necessity, a total win-win for the region and, frankly, for the whole world. And it was such a powerful vision, right? It promised freedom, progress, and this idea of self-determination for over 100 million people.
But a decade on, the reality on the ground, it tells a very, very different and much more complicated story.
So what happened to that promise? These movements were driven by just a few simple, really universal demands. But the outcomes? They were far from what anyone hoped for.
And when you look at it like this, the contrast is it's stark. The core demands were for jobs, justice, and dignity. But in so many places, what they got was the exact opposite. Rising unemployment, total impunity for abuses, and in the absolute worst cases, just devastating civil war.
So instead of democratic reform, a lot of these nations saw this brutal return to authoritarianism. And often, it was even more repressive than what came before. When the old regimes felt threatened, they fought back, and they fought back hard. Let's take a look at Bahrain as a case study.
So, take Bahrain. Back in 2001, a national charter actually promised democratic reforms, but then came the massive uprising in 2011. The state's reaction was what one report called a systematic campaign of retribution. It got so bad that by 2020, Human Rights Watch said the situation had only worsened, with the government having a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of dissent.
And the human cost here, it's just devastating. Detainees described routine torture, things like electric shocks and sexual abuse, all used to force confessions. An independent commission even confirmed there was an operational plan to terrorize protesters. It created this culture of impunity, where the abusers almost never faced any consequences.
Now, what's kind of a tragic irony here is that the protests mostly started over economic problems. But all the political instability that followed just made the economy even worse. Conflict and uncertainty, well, they scared away tourism and foreign investment.
The economic fallout was absolutely crushing. For the Arab countries that were in transition, the average annual growth rate was more than cut in half. It dropped from nearly 5% in the decade before the uprisings to just over 2% in the years that came after.
With growth that low, there was just no way for these economies to absorb the millions of young people who were entering the workforce, so it actually deepened the very unemployment crisis that helped fuel the uprisings in the first place.
And then you have the most tragic cases, where domestic power struggles didn't just lead to crackdowns, they spiraled into these devastating proxy wars. These are conflicts where outside powers use local groups to fight on their behalf. Yemen is the prime example here.
In Yemen, what started as an internal conflict just exploded into this incredibly complex proxy war. You can see the key players here. You've got Iran backing the Houthi rebels, which then prompted a Saudi-led coalition to support the official government. And then you have the UAE backing southern separatists. It turned a civil conflict into a full-blown regional battleground.
The humanitarian cost it's almost unimaginable. By the end of 2021, the UN estimated that the war had caused over 370,000 deaths. And that number isn't just people killed in combat. It also includes tens of thousands who died from indirect causes, things like starvation and diseases that should have been preventable.
On top of that staggering death toll, the conflict has internally displaced more than 4 million people. Think about that. That's 4 million individuals forced from their homes, shattering families, communities, and really the entire fabric of Yemeni society.
And all of this has pushed 3/4, 75% of the entire population into poverty. It's no wonder the United Nations has repeatedly called this one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world.
So all this turmoil also created a massive power vacuum. As the United States' role in the region began to shift, new global powers stepped in to fill that void. And in doing so, they fundamentally changed the rules of the game.
Russia and China especially played really distinct but also complementary roles. One analyst described Russia as the military spearhead. They intervened directly in Syria and used their diplomatic and energy leverage. Meanwhile, China acted as the economic handle, becoming the largest trading partner for most Arab countries and pulling the region into its massive Belt and Road Initiative. That's its global infrastructure project designed to connect China with the rest of the world. And all of this leaves us with a final, really critical question. The last decade showed the limits of American power in the Middle East. The next decade is going to be defined by how rising powers like Russia and China use their newfound influence, leaving the future of this absolutely vital region more uncertain than it's ever been.